What if everything you think you know about King Solomon is only the surface of a story far deeper, stranger, and more human than anyone ever told you? Most people grow up hearing that Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived, a flawless example of what happens when God gives someone incredible gifts. But the truth is that Solomon's life is not a simple tale of wisdom. It is a journey full of tension, pain, political manipulation, and divine purpose that often collided with human weakness. And when you begin to uncover the details hidden in the early chapters of his story, you start to see a picture that is both inspiring and unsettling. That contrast is exactly what makes this story impossible to ignore. Because before Solomon ever wore a crown, he was a child born into a family scandal. His story began long before he was old enough to understand that the world around him was shaped by the consequences of choices made by people whose names carried enormous weight. Solomon was not born into peace. He was born into a kingdom that was still bleeding from wars, from betrayal, from years in which King David had fought to unite Israel, while also battling the shadows within his own house. Israel was a nation trying to heal, and the royal family was doing the same. This is part of the story no one talks about, yet it sets the stage for everything that would come later. Imagine growing up, knowing that your father was a national hero who had built an empire, but also knowing he carried guilt and regrets that never left him. That was Solomon's reality. His mother, Bathsheba, was at the center of one of the most painful and controversial episodes in David's life. The entire kingdom knew the story. David had seen her bathing, desired her, and took actions that spiraled into tragedy. The consequences were so heavy that the prophet Nathan confronted David directly, delivering a message from God that shook the palace. Solomon entered the world, carrying not only the hope of his parents, but also the weight of a past that could not be erased. Yet from his birth, something unusual surrounded him. According to the biblical narrative, the prophet Nathan gave Solomon an additional name, Jedediah, meaning beloved of the Lord. That name was a sign that Solomon's life would not be defined by scandal, but by a grace and purpose beyond human expectation. Even so, growing up with such a destiny must have shaped his personality in ways rarely discussed. He was likely a child who watched more than he spoke, someone who felt the tension of a divided household, and a father aging under the pressure of holding a kingdom together. As David grew older, the political atmosphere around the palace became increasingly unstable. Many assumed that David's older sons would rule after him. Adonijah, in particular, believed the throne belonged to him by right. The tension inside the palace was a mixture of ambition, insecurity, and uncertainty. In the middle of this storm stood Solomon, young and quiet, yet chosen. David favored him, not because he was the oldest, but because he sensed something different in him. That choice created jealousy and fear, and those emotions would later explode into open conflict. People often imagine biblical kings as figures who were strengthened by certainty, but Solomon stepped into his future surrounded by pressure. He knew he was not the natural heir. He knew the nation was watching. He knew many believed he was too inexperienced to rule. Yet he also carried the knowledge that God had marked his life in a unique way. That combination of insecurity and destiny shaped him into someone who sought understanding early on. Some scholars believe this explains why, later in life, Solomon asked God specifically for wisdom. A child who grows up surrounded by complex emotions learns early that decisions carry consequences. Before Solomon ever sat on the throne, his future was already a battlefield. Adonijah attempted to claim the kingship for himself, gathering supporters and announcing his right to rule. The moment forced David, Bathsheba, and Nathan to act decisively. What followed was a delicate and dangerous maneuver to secure Solomon's place as the next king of Israel. It was not a simple coronation. It was a moment filled with political risk, personal pain, and spiritual significance. And this early conflict reveals an important truth that will follow Solomon throughout his life. His story is not only about wisdom, it is about the tension between divine calling and human vulnerability. Everything that shaped Solomon before the crown would become the foundation of the decisions he would later make as king. His early years teach us that greatness never begins in comfort. It begins in conflict, in uncertainty, and in the silent moments in which a person is forced to confront who they really are. Solomon's journey starts here, in the shadows of his family's history, in the quiet expectations placed upon him, and in the extraordinary promise that God saw something in him even before he saw it in himself. When Solomon finally stepped into the position of king, it did not happen in a moment of celebration. It happened in a moment of crisis. Adonijah had already tried to take the throne for himself, gathering influential men, preparing a feast, and acting as if David were no longer alive. The palace was tense, the nation was confused, and the future of Israel seemed to be hanging by a thread. It was in this atmosphere that Solomon was pushed forward, not because he was loud or demanding, but because time was running out and decisions had to be made quickly. David instructed his officials to place Solomon on the royal mule, an act that symbolized legitimate authority, and to proclaim him king publicly. In doing this, David made it clear that Solomon was the chosen successor, not through family ranking, but through divine direction and strategic leadership. Even with the public declaration, the early days of Solomon's reign were far from calm. A new king always faced challenges, but Solomon inherited a kingdom full of unresolved tensions, wounded pride, and people who believed they were more deserving of power than he was. One of Solomon's first responsibilities was to make decisions that would stabilize the throne. Some of those decisions were harsh, and they reveal a side of Solomon that is often ignored. He had to confront and remove individuals who posed threats to the unity of the kingdom. These actions were not expressions of cruelty, but of necessity. Ancient Israel was a place where hesitation could cost a king his life, and Solomon understood that if he did not act decisively, others would decide his future for him. The interesting thing is that these early decisions show how complex Solomon's leadership was. People often think of him only as the wise judge who knew how to settle disputes with calm intelligence. But before that reputation was formed, Solomon had to be a strategist. He had to recognize who stood beside him and who stood against him. His actions toward men like Adonijah, Joab, and Shimei were part of a larger effort to start his reign with strength. If he failed to secure his position at the beginning, everything that came after would be threatened. Some historians point out that this level of political awareness was unusual for someone as young as Solomon, which suggests that he had been observing the dynamics of the palace long before he ever wore a crown. After these immediate challenges, Solomon finally entered a phase where he could focus on the deeper responsibilities of kingship. One moment stands out so strongly that it still shapes how people view him today. Solomon traveled to Gibeon, where the tabernacle was located, to make sacrifices. It was there, in the quiet of the night, that God appeared to him in a dream. God asked Solomon what he desired. It was a question that tested the core of his character. Anyone in his position could have asked for wealth, for long life, or for victory over enemies. Instead, Solomon asked for an understanding heart, the ability to judge the people wisely, and to distinguish between right and wrong. This moment reveals something profound about who he was internally. A man who had grown up surrounded by tension understood that wisdom was more valuable than power. He knew that without clarity of mind, every decision he made could eventually harm the very people he was called to lead. From a psychological perspective, Solomon's request makes perfect sense. Children who grow up in environments filled with conflict, pressure, and uncertainty often develop a deep desire for understanding. They believe that if they can just see things clearly enough, they will avoid the mistakes they witnessed around them. Solomon did not ask for wisdom because he wanted to impress anyone. He asked because he knew the weight of responsibility and the fear of failure. Spiritually, his request reflected humility. He recognized that he could not rule Israel well without divine help. That level of self-awareness is rare, especially in a world where kings were expected to project confidence at all times. God's response was immediate and generous. Not only did he grant Solomon a wise and discerning heart, but he also promised him wealth, honor, and influence that no other king of Israel would surpass. This combination of wisdom and prosperity set the stage for the greatest era of peace Israel had ever known. And soon after this divine encounter, Solomon would face a situation that tested the wisdom he had just been given. Two women came before him, both claiming to be the mother of a single baby. There were no witnesses, no evidence, and no way to determine the truth through ordinary procedures. What happened next became one of the most famous judgments in ancient history. Solomon suggested dividing the child, knowing the true mother would rather lose the case than see her child harmed. This decision was not only brilliant, it revealed a deep understanding of human nature. Ancient societies praised this moment because it showed that Solomon could see into the heart of a situation, not just its surface. That judgment changed his reputation overnight. News of his wisdom spread across Israel, and the people recognized that God's presence was with him. It was the moment Solomon transitioned from being David's son to being the nation's leader. But more importantly, it marked the beginning of a reign that would grow in influence, wealth, and global recognition. The foundation for everything Solomon would build started with the choices he made in these early chapters of his life. His story was no longer about surviving palace politics. It was about stepping into the destiny that had been spoken over him from the beginning. As Solomon's reign matured, something remarkable began to unfold. Israel entered a period of stability and prosperity that the nation had never experienced before. With the throne secure and his reputation for wisdom firmly established, Solomon turned his attention to one of the greatest ambitions of his life, the construction of the temple. This was not simply a building project. It was the fulfillment of a promise David had carried in his heart, but was not allowed to execute. The responsibility passed to Solomon, and he embraced it with a sense of purpose that shaped the identity of Israel for generations. The Temple of Solomon was unlike anything the region had seen. It required thousands of workers, many of them skilled laborers from neighboring nations. Solomon coordinated with Hiram, the king of Tyre, who provided cedar, craftsmen, and expertise that Israel lacked. This partnership reveals how advanced Solomon's diplomatic skills were. He understood that wisdom was not just the ability to judge disputes, but also the ability to build alliances, use resources wisely, and draw on the strengths of others. The scale of the project was massive. The temple was meticulously planned, with precise dimensions, carefully selected materials, and decorations that reflected both reverence and majesty. Gold covered the inner surfaces. Precious stones adorned parts of the structure. Everything about the temple communicated the idea that the God of Israel deserved a house unlike any other. Many historians point out that the temple also served a political function. In the ancient world, a grand temple unified the people. It became a symbol of national identity and spiritual centrality. Solomon understood this dynamic well. By building a temple that stood at the heart of Jerusalem, he strengthened the unity of the tribes and reminded the nation that God's presence was the real foundation of its strength. The dedication ceremony was emotional, filled with prayer, worship, and a sense of awe as the presence of God filled the place. Solomon's prayer on that day reveals the depth of his understanding about the fragile nature of human hearts and the constant need for divine guidance. It was one of the highest spiritual moments of his reign. Yet the temple was only one of his major projects. Solomon also built a royal palace that took even longer to complete. While the temple took 7 years, his palace required 13. This detail often surprises people because it shows that Solomon did not hesitate to invest in political power and personal authority. The palace was a complex of buildings, courtyards, and administrative halls that allowed him to centralize government operations. Some scholars suggest that the palace reflects Solomon's desire to demonstrate that Israel had become a significant power. Architecture was communication in the ancient world, and Solomon communicated strength, organization, and royal dignity. His building projects extended throughout the land. He fortified cities, constructed storage facilities, and developed strategic trade routes. These expansions were not random. They were part of a larger vision to transform Israel from a regional kingdom into a major international presence. His alliance with Hiram opened the door for maritime trade. Together, they built fleets that sailed to distant locations, bringing back gold, ivory, spices, and exotic animals. Israel's wealth grew, and other nations took notice. Reports of Solomon's wisdom and prosperity spread across borders until they reached the ears of one of the most mysterious figures in ancient literature, the Queen of Sheba. The visit of the Queen of Sheba is one of the most fascinating episodes in Solomon's story. Scholars debate her exact identity, with some placing her in modern Ethiopia and others in southern Arabia. Regardless of her origin, she was clearly a woman of power, influence, and curiosity. She came to Jerusalem with a caravan loaded with gifts, not simply to admire Solomon's wealth, but to test his mind. She asked him hard questions, questions meant to reveal whether his wisdom was genuine or exaggerated by rumor. The biblical account says that Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was too difficult for him. This interaction shows that Solomon's reputation was not built on empty claims. He truly possessed insight that impressed even the most powerful rulers of his time. Their meeting also had political significance. By acknowledging Solomon's greatness, the Queen of Sheba strengthened his international standing. Their exchange of gifts was symbolic of mutual respect. Some later traditions expanded the story, suggesting a possible romance or cultural exchange that impacted future generations. While the biblical text does not explore that level of detail, it does highlight the remarkable impression Solomon made on her. She declared that what she had heard about him was only half of the truth. In her view, his wisdom and prosperity exceeded every report. By this point in his reign, Solomon was at the height of his power. His court was functioning smoothly, his nation was at peace, and his influence stretched far beyond Israel's borders. The combination of wisdom, wealth, diplomacy, and architectural achievement made Solomon one of the most impressive rulers of the ancient world. But this success also carried hidden dangers. The peace he created required constant attention to maintain. The wealth he accumulated demanded continuous oversight. The admiration he received from other nations had begun to feed something inside him that would eventually become a weakness. What once made him strong could, if left unchecked, become the doorway to his downfall. As the years passed and Solomon settled deeper into the comfort of power, the tone of his reign began to shift. The man who started with humility asking God for an understanding heart, slowly became entangled in the very things that wisdom should have helped him avoid. This is one of the most sobering themes in his story. Greatness is fragile. Success can become a trap. What begins as blessing can, without careful discipline, turn into the very thing that pulls a person away from the values that made them strong in the first place. Solomon's first major step toward decline was the expansion of his marriages. In the ancient world, royal marriages were often political tools used to establish alliances. In moderate numbers, this was normal. But Solomon went far beyond political necessity. The biblical record states that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. These women came from many nations, each bringing their own cultural traditions and religious beliefs. At first, these alliances strengthened Israel's diplomatic relationships. But over time, they began to influence Solomon's personal convictions. A man who had once prayed for discernment began to tolerate practices that contradicted the very faith Israel was built upon. The most troubling consequence of these marriages was the introduction of foreign worship into Israel. Solomon not only allowed his wives to continue their religious traditions, he eventually supported them. In some cases, he built places of worship for their gods. This included altars for deities like Chemosh and Molech, names associated with disturbing practices that stood in direct opposition to Israel's faith. Scholars and historians often emphasize how shocking this was, because the man who had built the temple for the Lord, the most sacred structure in Israel's history, was now constructing altars for gods that represented everything Israel had been commanded to reject. This contrast between early devotion and later compromise is one of the core reasons Solomon's life is studied so intensely. From a psychological perspective, this period reveals something important about human nature. Solomon lived in an environment where he was admired constantly. People praised his intelligence, his prosperity, and his accomplishments. When someone becomes used to admiration, they can slowly lose the internal discipline that once kept their heart aligned with truth. The external world becomes louder than the internal voice of conscience. The lines between what is wise and what is convenient begin to blur. Solomon's love for foreign women did not simply pull him away from faith. It placed him in a position where he believed he was strong enough to handle the spiritual risks. But spiritual drift rarely feels dangerous at first. It begins with small compromises, and only later reveals how far the heart has wandered. Another factor in Solomon's decline was the growing isolation that often comes with power. Leaders who reach the top of society can find themselves surrounded by people who will not challenge them. Their words carry so much weight that few dare to question their decisions. Solomon, who once relied on God for guidance, increasingly relied on his own judgment. This shift can be seen in the tone of his later writings, especially in Ecclesiastes. The book reads like the journal of a man who has tasted everything life can offer and found it all empty. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. This emotional exhaustion reveals that wealth and pleasure, when disconnected from purpose, cannot satisfy the human heart. As Solomon drifted spiritually, cracks began to appear in the nation he governed. God sent warnings, making it clear that his actions were leading Israel toward trouble. But the consequences were not immediate. This delay is important. Sometimes the most dangerous judgment is not a sudden punishment, but a gradual unfolding of consequences that were set in motion long before. During Solomon's lifetime, Israel remained intact, but the seeds of division had been planted. Internal dissatisfaction grew, especially among laborers who felt burdened by Solomon's building projects and taxation policies. One of the most significant figures to emerge during this period was Jeroboam. He was hardworking, intelligent, and recognized by others as a natural leader. Solomon appointed him to oversee part of the labor force. But when the prophet Ahijah told Jeroboam that God intended to tear part of the kingdom away from Solomon's line as a consequence of idol worship, tensions escalated. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, forcing him to flee to Egypt. This moment signaled how far Solomon had fallen. A king who had once used wisdom to bring peace was now using fear to maintain control. As Solomon's life neared its end, the kingdom trembled under the weight of the choices he had made. The man who began with extraordinary potential found himself surrounded by political unrest, spiritual emptiness, and a legacy that was no longer purely glorious. His decline is one of the most powerful reminders in Scripture that wisdom is not a one-time gift. It must be protected. It must be practiced daily. Without intentional discipline, even the wisest among us can drift away from what is right. The tragedy of Solomon's fall is not that he lacked wisdom. It's that he stopped living according to it. And the cost of that decision would echo long after he was gone. The kingdom that once stood united under David and Solomon would soon break apart, creating wounds that would shape the future of Israel for generations. When Adam and Eve finally stepped outside the garden, they carried something they had never experienced before. A mixture of fear and hope, a painful awareness of what they had lost, and a quiet longing for what they did not yet understand. The world beyond Eden was not silent. It was not gentle. The wind felt colder. The ground felt harder. Nothing around them echoed the perfect harmony they had once known. But still, something inside them whispered that the story was not over. They had left the garden, but they had not left the eyes of the one who created them. This moment is one of the most significant turning points in all of Scripture. It teaches us that even when humanity walks away from God, God does not walk away from humanity. The Bible does not end with exile. It begins with exile, which means the entire story that follows is a story of returning, a story of restoration, a story of a God who pursues his creation even when his creation fails to pursue him. As Adam looked at the land in front of him, he felt the weight of responsibility unlike anything he had carried before. He had once named animals with joy. Now he would work the soil with sweat. He had once walked with God without fear. Now he would rely on faith. Eve looked at the horizon and wondered how life would unfold outside perfection. She felt the sharp reality of consequence, but she also felt the mystery of promise. The promise that through her, life would continue, that through her, creation would not end, that through her, the plan of redemption would one day begin to unfold in a way she could not imagine. And this is where the depth of the story reaches us. Because we too live outside Eden. We too know what it feels like to lose what once felt safe. We know what it feels like to carry regrets. We know the taste of wrong choices. We know the silence that follows disobedience. We know the distance that grows when we run in the wrong direction. But just like Adam and Eve, we also live under a promise. The promise that God does not abandon the broken. The promise that grace is stronger than shame. The promise that even our failures can become the fertile ground where redemption grows. The story of Adam and Eve has been told for thousands of years, but it is not merely history. It is a mirror. Every one of us has had an Eden moment, a moment when we chose something we knew we should not choose. A moment when curiosity grew into temptation, and temptation grew into action. A moment when we realized too late that the price was higher than we expected. But the beauty of the biblical narrative is that it never leaves us in despair. Adam and Eve walked out of the garden, but they walked with a covering God provided. That covering was not random. It was symbolic. It was the first hint of the redemption that would one day come through Christ. God himself made the first sacrifice. God Himself covered their shame. God Himself extended grace before they even knew how to ask for it. This is why their story still echoes today. It is not a story about a serpent and a fruit. It is a story about the heart. About the choices we make when no one is watching. About the consequences that follow disobedience. But also about the God who meets us in the aftermath. The God who steps into the brokenness we created. The God who refuses to let our story end in exile. As Adam and Eve took their first steps into the unknown, they held on to a truth they had learned the hard way. God was just, but God was also merciful. God punished, but God also provided. God allowed distance, but God left a path to return. Their new beginning was difficult, but it was not hopeless. And so the story closes not with despair, but with direction. Humanity fell, but humanity was not forgotten. We were separated from Eden, but not separated from God. The Bible begins by showing us how paradise was lost, but it continues by showing us how paradise can be restored. Their journey becomes our reminder that failure is not final, that grace is real, and that redemption is always possible for those who seek the one who first sought us.